Welcome to This Explainer. Imagine, just for a second, a single corporation becoming so unbelievably powerful that it actually swallows an entire subcontinent. Well, today we are unpacking a truly fascinating yet deeply devastating chapter of world history. We're looking at India's transition from a wildly wealthy global powerhouse to what was famously known as the jewel of the British Empire. This is a massive story, really. It's about immense wealth, absolute corporate overreach, and the very harsh realities of colonial extraction.
But before we even start tracing the timeline, you have to consider this one mind-blowing fact: 25%. Up until the 16th century, India generated at least 1/4 of the entire global GDP. Think about that. It was one of the two largest economies in the world, right alongside China. So the crucial takeaway here is that India wasn't just some random region. It was this vibrant, immensely prosperous economic and cultural juggernaut. And honestly, that explains exactly why European powers were so absolutely desperate to get their hands on it.
So, we'll follow a clear path today. We'll start with India as a global powerhouse, then move into the age of colonialism, the early European intruders, the British corporate takeover, the tactics of divide, rule, and annex, and finally, we'll look at the true cost of empire.
Section 1. India, the global powerhouse. A vibrant economy before Europe arrived. Just to give you a real sense of that scale, long before any European ships ever dropped anchor, this was a civilization already exporting highly advanced wood, steel, ivory, fine cotton, and precious spices. Basically all the luxury goods that the rest of the world was totally desperate for.
Section 2. The Age of Colonialism, the Scramble for Global Influence. Beginning in the 15th century, fierce political competition back in Europe sparked this frantic, super-aggressive race for territorial expansion. And this was completely driven by the desire for new natural resources, new markets, and, quite frankly, raw plunder.
Let's ground ourselves for a minute. The historical record clearly defines colonialism as the practice where one country takes control of another region, establishes settlements there, and then imposes its own political, economic, and cultural systems. And as our source material emphasizes, these conquests weren't peaceful. They were frequently achieved through military campaigns that involved severe violence or the direct enslavement of native populations.
Now, colonizers obviously needed to justify these actions, right? You often see these justifications in the media of the time, like a famous 1892 Punch magazine cartoon showing a British magnate literally straddling Africa with a telegraph wire. The colonizers would often claim they were on this noble, civilizing mission to bring progress to people they falsely and very intentionally demonized as primitive or savage. But that was just the facade. The reality, as historical studies document, was the total loss of independence, massive exploitation of local resources, and the active destruction of traditional ways of life for the colonized people.
Section 3. Early European intruders. The Portuguese, Dutch, and French. Because, while we immediately think of the British when we talk about India, they actually weren't the first, nor were they the only European players to target India's riches. It's not like this was an overnight invasion. It was a staggered arrival. The Portuguese kicked things off way back in 1498 when they arrived at Calicut. Over a century later, around 1612, the English East India Company set up their early trading posts. Then, the French followed suit, getting a post at Pondicherry in 1674. And we also have the Dutch, whose ambitions in India were famously halted with a major defeat in 1741. So over a couple of centuries, you had all these powers fiercely competing to establish their own footholds.
Let's anchor this history with that very first arrival. When Vasco da Gama landed in 1498, he was initially received pretty well, but things escalated into violence incredibly quickly. By his second voyage, he was literally seizing and killing Indian merchants and bombarding Calicut from the sea. The Portuguese secured their dominance by implementing what was called the cartéis, basically a naval pass system that forced all ships in the Arabian Sea to buy Portuguese permits or face being seized. It was essentially extortion. And beyond commerce, they also instituted the brutal Goa Inquisition in 1560. This severely persecuted Hindus, Muslims, Jews, and suspected heretics, and was accompanied by forced religious conversions and the total destruction of temples.
So, following the Portuguese, the Dutch and French arrived with their own unique strategies. The Dutch focused mostly on the commercial spice trade, but their presence was severely limited after a crushing defeat in 1741 at the Battle of Colonial. They were actually beaten by the Asian forces of King Marthanda Varma of Travancore. The French, on the other hand, pioneered some highly dangerous colonial strategies under their Governor-General Dupleix. They began training Indian soldiers in European military techniques,
creating the infantry known as sepoys. And they developed this incredibly insidious strategy of indirect rule, where they would install puppet rulers by getting involved in local succession disputes.
Section 4. The British Corporate Takeover. From Traders to Rulers. This is where the story shifts entirely to the English East India Company, who basically watched these French tactics and completely weaponized them.
Okay, here is the exact playbook the East India Company used to conquer India from within. This is hands down one of history's most remarkable examples of a corporate entity transforming into a full-blown imperial power. Step 1. Arrive pretending to be harmless traders. Spoiler alert, they weren't. Step 2. Secretly cultivate political relationships with regional rulers. Step 3. Offer military support to these rulers against their local rivals, which allowed the British to emerge as essential power brokers rather than foreign invaders. And finally, Step 4. Once in power, mercilessly extract the region's wealth. They brilliantly and ruthlessly disguised a military invasion as a simple commercial enterprise.
Section 5. Divide, rule, and annex. Expanding an empire on the cheap. The tactic here was highly calculated. They exploited existing divisions within Indian society, identifying and actively encouraging tensions between religious communities and regional leaders.
And this brings us to a massive turning point, the Battle of Plassey in 1757. Tensions had completely boiled over between the Nawab of Bengal and company officials led by Robert Clive. But here's the thing, Clive didn't win through sheer military might. He won through pure conspiracy. He identified disgruntled elements in the Nawab's court and essentially bribed the military commander Mir Jafar to just stand aside during the battle in exchange for the throne. It was a staggering betrayal. In fact, even today in India, the name Mir Jafar remains completely synonymous with traitor. But for the British, this betrayal secured their first major territorial control.
As the 19th century rolled in, the British started introducing these aggressive legal loopholes to swallow up even more territory. The most infamous of these was the doctrine of lapse. This policy dictated that any princely state would be automatically annexed into British territory if its ruler died without a natural-born male heir, completely disregarding the long-standing Hindu tradition of legal adoption. Combined with what were called subsidiary alliances, where Indian rulers were literally forced to pay to house British troops, the British effectively forced Indian leaders to fund their own subjugation. It was an empire built on the cheap.
Section 6. The Cost of Empire. From Paradise to Hell. It is absolutely essential to look closely at the devastating human realities of this British administrative greed. So the East India Company had secured the right to collect revenue in some of India's richest regions, places that Robert Clive himself had called the paradise of the earth. But the company extracted maximum revenue while investing practically nothing back into the land. In 1770, a catastrophic famine hit Bengal. Because the company maintained and in some cases even increased their extremely harsh cash tax targets despite total crop failures, an estimated 10 million people, that is 1/3 of the population, died. According to a harrowing account from a British official, W. Hunter, as the dying continued, farmers devoured their seed grain, they sold their cattle, they sold their sons and daughters, and eventually they ate the leaves of trees and the grass of the field. And this reveals the stark, horrifying paradox of colonial administration even a century later. During the Great Famine of 1876 to 1878, up to 8 million Indians perished. Yet the crisis was exacerbated by artificial scarcity. While millions were quite literally starving to death, the colonial administration continued to export vast amounts of local grain right out of the country. According to the historical record, they shipped about 1 million tons of rice alone to Britain every single year during the absolute height of the famine.
So the crucial takeaway here is this absolute contrast between the before and the after. We started with an India that generated 25% of the global GDP, a place recognized all over the world for its immense prosperity. But by the height of the colonial era, that vibrant economy had been completely hollowed out through corporate takeovers, incredibly harsh taxation, and relentless resource extraction. It resulted in plundered wealth and millions dead, and what were completely preventable, artificial famine.
We've unpacked the highly calculated ways in which a global powerhouse was systematically dismantled through colonial expansion, military coercion, and really devastating corporate greed. But history doesn't just stop when the empire ends, does it? When you look at global economics and political borders today, how does the legacy of this empire on the cheap still shape the modern world we live in right now? Thanks for exploring this history with me today in this explainer. Keep asking questions and keep seeking to understand the tapestry of our past.